Good morning, everyone. I'm so excited. We have Ashley Fordham here to talk about lead-based paint with you all today. And Ashley has some unique experience when it comes to lead-based paint, so I know it will be a great session this morning. Take it away, Ashley.
Awesome. Thanks, Kayla. Good morning, everybody. I'm really excited to be here with Kayla here at OAR this morning. I know lead-based paint sounds like a very entertaining topic, but I promise I will make it lively and educational. So if at any point you have any questions when we're going through the presentation, please just send Kayla a message and we'll talk about it at that time because I don't want you to lose sight of whatever question you had. So with that being said, let's just jump right on in to this. There we go. Okay, so a little bit about me. I began working in the real estate industry back in 2008, where I worked for a very small property management firm here in Salem. I began selling and managing rentals simultaneously back in 2010 and have been selling properties ever since. Currently, I'm the managing principal broker at Remax Integrity here in Salem, but I cover for all 6 of our offices throughout the state of Oregon. I've been a lifetime resident of the Willamette Valley, and I have really, really in-depth personal experience with lead-based paint, which included an audit from both HUD and EPA. So I kind of want to give you guys a little bit of a backstory on that because I think it's really important for you to understand kind of the marriage between the lead-based paint liability and the audit experience that I had back in the early 2000s. So long story short, the small firm that I started working with had an audit that was an in-person audit with both HUD and EPA, and it was very, very intense. We welcomed them into our building. They kind of audited our files and determined that there were some missing lead-based paint disclosure forms on some rental properties that we had been managing. And long story short, the audit essentially took place for a number of years. I want to say it drug on for 7 years. The owner ended up having to repair target properties. It became a really large fiasco. And I don't think that people really realize the correlation between lead-based paint liability and what can actually happen in real life with some of the liabilities that come with renovation repair and not disclosing properly to said target properties. So today what I want to talk about is a little bit about lead. What is lead specifically? Why is it a problem? What does it look like in our real estate transactions? And why is it so important that we properly fill out those real estate disclosures? And then go a little bit deeper into what I like to call the lead-based paint rabbit hole and talk about what are those liabilities? What does it look like when you're selling a target property to an investor who's planning to flip it? What does it look like when you're selling a target property to a person who's using it as a rental, or perhaps you're inheriting a tenant at the purchase and was never properly disclosed. So I think just as real estate brokers and practitioners, it's important for us to be well-rounded in those kinds of scenarios. And so I'll dive into that later on. But for now, I think that's a little bit about me and kind of what we're going to be talking about today. And as I said, again, if you have any questions, feel free to jump in at any point and let us know. Okay, so with that being said, let's get started. A lot of times people ask me, they're like, what is lead? I don't really understand why it's such a big deal. I don't know what the compounds are. Why was it used in paint? So just really surface level science, because I'm definitely not a scientist, but surface level, lead is a chemical element of the periodic table with the symbol Pb and the atomic number of 82. It is a very soft, heavy, toxic, and malleable pore metal. It's kind of bluish white, but when it's freshly cut or when it touches air, it turns kind of like a dull gray. I'm sure you guys have probably seen like bullets, how they sometimes kind of turn into that, I don't know, that dull kind of gross color. They're often used in building materials, lead acid batteries, and of course I talked about bullets just a second ago. So that's just a basic overview of what lead is. So why is everyone so concerned with lead in building materials, and how does it affect the human body? So lead affects practically all systems of the body. At high levels, it can cause just simply like comas, death, convulsion. Lower levels of lead can adversely affect the brain, central nervous system, blood cells, kidneys. I mean, really high levels of lead poisoning can be very, very, very crucial to, I mean, basically it can kill you. It's just a really bad situation. Additionally, the effects of lead exposures on fetuses and young children can be severe. They include delays in physical and mental development, lower IQ levels, shortened attention spans, and increased behavioral problems. So that's one of the reasons why they're so concerned about lead-based paint renovation in properties with, you know, young children under the age of 6 or pregnant women. So again, it's really crucial that we're kind of monitoring those age levels and the people that are in that particular property, target property, as you will. So most people, when they talk about lead-based paint, they assume that lead was in every single jar of paint that you purchased, which is not actually true. Lead was a very expensive additive to paint. And so oftentimes when you are talking about properties that are pre-1978, you are looking at potential lead-based paint on the exterior and maybe some interior friction properties. But basically it would speed up drying, increase durability, maintain a fresh appearance, and resist moisture that often leads to corrosion. And because lead was so expensive, you often find it on properties of the exterior, like I said, and interior of higher end homes. So it's really funny to me because people often ask me, they'll say, well, if I have my property tested and it's built prior to 1978, I'm going to assume that every single area of a property has lead on it. But that's not actually the case. And so for EPA and HUD standards, when we're talking about target property and friction surfaces, target property is anything prior to 1978. Okay, and friction surfaces would be a good example of that. Would be like kitchen cabinets. People would often paint their kitchen cabinets white, and they would use lead in their paint to make sure that the paint stayed resilient and didn't chip as much or as often. And as such, that friction, what will happen is those cabinets slamming against each other just creates what's called lead dust, which then emits into the air, and then people are inhaling it. So that's how you kind of get that friction surface type situation. So really, when you talk about testing a property that's pre-78, it's very unlikely that you're going to find it on every single surface. And you can also kind of identify where the higher end homes would be because lead was so expensive. You can know, like here in Salem, Bush Park is notorious for having high concentrates of lead because it is a higher end area. So that's just a good example of finding lead in a property. So moving on, I want to talk to you guys a little bit about the real estate notification and disclosure rule. I want to talk to you about HUD and EPA. I want to talk about the testing types that you can do to determine if a property has lead and why or why not why you should be using them, or maybe why you shouldn't be. Remediation and renovation rules, and then investment property liability. Because again, like I said earlier, lead-based paint is we as brokers tend to take it very surface level. We do our due diligence, we have the disclosure sign, and then we don't go down the rabbit hole. So I'm going to take you down the rabbit hole with me today. Okay, so as you all know, as real estate agents, we play such an important role in getting our buyers and sellers in or out of their properties. So buildings built prior to 1978 are much more likely to have a lead-based paint a liability present. And I'll give you a slide much later down into the presentation that kind of shows you the breakdown of the percentages of homes, and it's actually very interesting. But the federal law requires that sellers and agents provide certain important information about lead paint before a prospective buyer is obligated under a contract to purchase a target property. So 3 things that we as realtors must do. We have to inform the seller of his or her obligation under the real estate notification and disclosure rule. In addition, the agent is responsible if the seller or lessor fails to comply unless the failure involves specific lead-based paint or lead-based paint hazard information that the seller or lessor did not disclose to the agent. Okay, so it's really super important that you guys are having conversations with your seller or your owner of the property to make sure that you clearly understand if there is a lead hazard or not. Obviously, it's to the best of that person's knowledge. So if they've never had the property tested, they're going to assume that there is no lead-based paint there, but they have to disclose that the property's built prior to 1978. Secondly, we have to provide as part of the contract process is an EPA-approved information pamphlet on identifying and controlling lead-based paint hazards titled Protect Your Family from Lead in Your Home. And I know you guys are all super familiar with that document, and you're super familiar with the disclosure that is typically tied. So those 2 documents are typically married in a real estate transaction. So we hand them the pamphlet, have them sign it. So attach to the contract or insert language in the contract that a lead warning statement and confirmation that you have complied with all notification requirements. So that is included in our ORF documents. Forms Committee have done a great job of making sure that we're adhering to that rule. And then lastly, we have to provide a 10-day period to conduct a paint inspection or risk assessment for lead-based paint or lead-based paint hazards. So that is also a federally mandated law. It's something that a buyer can choose to waive. Something that they can choose to extend if both parties agree, but 10 days is the minimum. And that again is decided by the federal law. So moving on, again, this is really, you guys are, protect your family from lead in your home. You're familiar with that pamphlet. I'm sure you hand it out all the time. Some of you may pre-order them from HUD or EPA and get the nice little blue printed ones. Some of you may just pull them from the ORF library and print it there. But I want to talk specifically about the lead-based paint disclosure and some of the infractions that I see as a managing principal broker all the time. So usually most people, when they're filling this out, they assume, okay, let's just say the seller says there's no knowledge and we have no records, right? So they check both. Let's see, on section 1, they check line 20, item B, and line 26, item B. Then we, as the buyer's agent, move along and have our clients initial both lines 28 and 29. So as you know, that's incorrect. So if you are working with a buyer and both of the boxes are checked above that section for buyer's acknowledgement that say that there is no records and they have no knowledge, then you do not have your buyer sign the received copies from 2A above, right? So that's just, I see that all the time as a managing principal broker as an incorrect thing. And I want to specifically point that out because every single infraction that's done on this form is a $16,000 fine, and it is not covered by your E&O insurance. It is a civil penalty. So you can imagine that's just a silly mistake that we do not want to inherit. So I've also had conversations with people where maybe the listing agent hasn't submitted the lead-based paint disclosure to your client. You as a broker are still responsible for supplying that to your buyer. So whether or not it's been filled out by the seller or not, you still have to provide the pamphlet and you have to have the form acknowledging that the buyer has received a copy of that pamphlet. So just make sure that you guys are filling these out properly because again, it's $16,000 per infraction and it is not covered by your E&O insurance, which we in that audit found out. So just speaking from personal experience, it's not something that you want to accept as liability. So moving on to our next topic. So you can see I've copied and pasted this from our sales contract, but it does in our sales agreement, it does cover the lead-based paint contingency period. It's got the 10-day inspection provided within the ORF sales agreement. It's on page 4, line 198 through 208. Again, this is a federally mandated inspection timeline, but the buyer can waive their right to do an inspection on the lead-based paint if they want to. So it's pretty simple. Do we have any questions so far? Are we doing good?
No questions. We're doing good.
Sweet. Okay. So let's go down the rabbit hole. So why is it so important to accurately fill out the lead-based paint disclosure form? So you can see the top two above that black line are really real estate transaction specific. So item number 1 is it's a $16,000 fine in civil penalties with each occurrence on that disclosure form. So if there's any mistakes that are filled out improperly by you as an agent, then it's $16,000. And again, it's not covered by your E&O insurance. So, I mean, you could easily be looking at several $1,000s in fines if you messed up 3 times or if you didn't disclose it. So if you have no lead-based paint, then it's for every single line that should have been checked, which like, I don't do math, but that's a lot. It's a lot. So the second half of that is really kind of getting into the weeds of lead-based paint and what does it look like as a professional? How should we be guiding our clients in addition to the fines? You know, what if we fail to disclose as brokers, what kind of liability are we opening our clients up to? And so, for example, HUD will want every non-owner occupant target property. Okay, so when I say target property, I mean built prior to 1978, tested for lead-based paint. And then once a non-owner occupant target property properties are tested, HUD will require remediation of all friction and impact surfaces, okay? So when we talk about remediation, these are a couple terms that I'm going to be using periodically throughout this presentation, but remediation is essentially elimination of lead-based paint completely, or oftentimes, as I'll show you as examples later on in this presentation, ways that you can cover that lead-based paint friction surface. So friction and impact, again, those are the surfaces that have lead-based paint that can create lead dust and create that lead poisoning.
So Ashley, real quick, have you ever seen lead in homes, or would there ever be a reason to test homes that were constructed after 1978 for lead?
It's very unlikely that a property constructed after 1978 would have lead-based paint in it, unless they had some sort of old paint can laying around in their garage. This is very common, that had lead in it, and they maybe used it to paint one wall or a couple walls. It's possible, but in HUD and EPA's eyes, they don't consider it likely. So that for law purposes, they do not require testing on a property after 1978.
Got it.
Is it possible? Theoretically, yes, but I'll show you kind of the percentages later on down the line with the breakdown of the eras of properties, and you can kind of see the percentages, and they drastically get smaller and smaller. I mean, 50s and 60s, I think it's like close to 24%. I mean, it's pretty nominal when you're talking about target properties, but that's a good question.
And then one more. So if you have folks living in a house that was constructed prior to 1978, and maybe they're trying to sell it or something like that, would it then be required that they have a lead test?
If it's owner occupied, no. If it is used for any type of compensation, whether that's a flip or a rental, by standards, if they're planning to do any remediation work, which I'll kind of go into the weeds a little bit about square footage and disturbance of that, then yes, they should be. Now, we can disclose to our sellers all day long. That doesn't necessarily mean that they listen or that they comply. And if that's the case, then it's just one of those circumstances where you document that conversation, you do some broker notes, and you add it to your file. And so when HUD and EPA come knocking on your door, you can be like, oh, hey, I had a conversation about it. That's, their personal property, it's their rights. The liability is theoretically on the seller. So yeah, good question.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so moving on. So really quickly, I want to talk about just what EPA and HUD are, because I think sometimes people can get confused about what those agencies do and why are they auditing brokerages and why are they having conversations with real estate brokers. And really what it comes down to is EPA is the United States Environmental Protection Agency, and they began back in 1970, and their mission really is to protect human health and environments. So they care specifically about that friction dust, and they want to know, okay, are we protecting the environment by ensuring that the property is when it's renovated, are they sealing things off? Are they properly handling that lead dust? Are they cleaning it up? That's kind of where EPA comes in. HUD comes in because they want to make sure that the housing that's being offered is safe to tenants or future buyers or owner occupants. So when you marry the two together, they are very serious about lead-based paint, and that's why we experienced that audit with both EPA and HUD. So oftentimes people are like, well, was it the agency? No, it wasn't the agency. It was EPA and HUD. They do care, and they have that federal mandate in the law to review any lead-based paint disclosures. So moving on, I have read the entire lead-based paint rule, and if you guys want a very boring, very boring book to read, you should pull that out. But I want to talk about the renovation, repair, and painting program rule, and this is basically just a snippet, a breakdown of essentially what the requirements are. And so it says, common renovation activities like sanding, cutting, and demolition can create hazardous dust and chips by disturbing lead-based paint, which can be harmful to children and adults. So again, that's the target properties pre-1978. To protect against this risk, on April 22nd, 2008, EPA issued a lead renovation, repair, and painting rule requiring the use of lead-safe practices and other actions aimed at preventing lead poisoning. Under the rule, beginning on April 22nd, 2010, contractors performing renovation, repair, and painting projects that disturb lead-based paint in homes, childcare facilities, and schools built before 1978 must be certified and must follow specific work practices to prevent lead contamination. So
Wow.
yeah, so it's a pretty intense rule. And so when you really break that down and you read the law and what they're requiring, it's an interesting kind of rabbit hole again. So we'll talk about that in a second. So to be clear, this rule applies to your investors, flippers, or anyone planning to use the property for compensation, and only if the target property is built before 1978. The target property has never been tested for lead-based paint, therefore we have to assume that lead-based paint is present, and the target property has been tested for lead-based paint and it has been confirmed lead is present. So the beautiful thing about testing a property that's pre-1978 is that you can determine, okay, there's just lead on the exterior, no lead on the interior, or there's only lead on this wall, or there's only lead on, you know, this friction surface. So a lot of times what you'll find is lead-based paint is so spotty in a property that it's unlikely you're going to find it everywhere. Because again, it was an additive to paint. And so people got to be selective about where they added it. So you might have that random case where it's on that one wall where they used that, like I said earlier, that can of paint that had lead in it, but that is so few and far between that it's really going to be on your friction surfaces, it's going to be on the exterior, and it's unlikely going to be just throughout the entire property. So you can see kind of the value of potentially having a property tested if you're going to be using a property for compensation. But really, if your client decides not to have the property tested and they don't use lead safe practices, they could be opening themselves up to a really big liability if, you know, they remodel the property, they disturb the lead dust, you know, they have a family that moves into the property, maybe one of the women is pregnant, or there's a child under the age of 6 and they get lead poisoning. Eek. It's a very big liability. So just to be clear, you know, it's always better to be safe than sorry. So it's our jobs as realtors to make sure that our clients are educated. So this is the kicker. This, I think, is really kind of interesting. The rule does not apply if obviously the house is built after 1978, which is what we talked about earlier. The housing is a 0-bedroom dwelling, or housing is for elderly or disabled, and no children are expected to reside in the home or the building. That's interesting to me. I thought, well, okay, we'll go with that. The work is a lead abatement project. So when I say lead abatement project, that typically means that the property is vacant. There's lead safe practices. They're getting rid of the property. I don't know, they're tearing it down. It could be any number of things. So there's really no one to worry about receiving lead-based paint poisoning. Minor repair and maintenance activities that will disturb 6 square feet or less of painted surfaces per room for interior projects, and 20 square feet or less of exterior painted projects. So I want to be super specific about that, because if you have a property that's pre-78 and you're just going in to disturb, I don't know, 3 square feet, you don't have to use lead safe practices. They consider that to be fine. But if you're going to pull out an entire window of a property, you've never had the property tested for lead-based paint, and you're disturbing more than 20 square feet of the exterior, you'd have to use lead safe practices. So that can get very expensive if it's owner occupied, or tenant occupied, or you're planning to use it for compensation. And then of course, this rule does not apply if a homeowner is performing renovation, repair, and or painting work on their own property in which they occupy. So so my very first house was built in 1962. I did renovation work. I knew that it probably didn't have lead, so I didn't personally test on it. But if I was planning to use it for renovation for a tenant, then I absolutely would have had it tested and made sure that I disclosed that. So it's just one of those things that is nice, that the homeowner, if they're occupying it, has the opportunity to test it. If they don't want to, they don't have to. It's not an obligation under the federal law. So the law. So federal law requires contractors that disturb paint surfaces in homes, childcare facilities, and schools built before 1978 be lead certified and follow specific work practices to prevent contamination. Federal law also requires that occupants receive certification information prior to renovating more than 6 square feet of the painted surfaces in a room for interior projects, and more than 20 square feet of painted surfaces for exterior projects such as window replacement or demolition. I can talk. So again, your client needs to be aware of the square footage rule, because it does apply. So if you're going in, you purchased a target property, it is occupied by tenants, and you're doing some remediation work after the close of escrow, you need to make sure that you have lead safe work practices unless you've had it tested. So to make things more confusing, HUD kind of jumps in and says, investment properties built prior to 78 currently housing a Section 8 tenant, the renovation square foot rule changes because they like to make us like think on our toes, right? So instead of 6 square feet, if you're working with a target property that has the Section 8 housing tenant, it's 3 square feet of painted surfaces, which is not a lot of room,
No.
and 16 square feet of exterior projects instead of 20. So it's really important that you guys are making sure that the contractor that's working with Section 8 tenants on these projects are certified, because if they're not, HUD will be all over that. Again, if you've had the property tested, not a big deal. They're gonna just totally, they know what's there, they know what surfaces are lead and which ones are not, so you can move on. Any questions so far? Nope. Okay, so protect yourself and your clients, get all of the facts. So you can kind of see, I chose this picture specifically because it's a really great example of what lead-based paint typically looks like when it has been weathered. We've all kind of seen that crocodile, like skin type peeling, and then the peeling paint at the very top of the eave there. You can kind of, it's just a very notorious lead-based paint. So if you ever see that on a property, just know that that is in fact lead, and you're going to have to deal with it at some point. Whether you continue to leave it like that or not is up to you, I guess, but that's telltale signs. So when you're showing houses to your clients, you can know that that's what you're looking for. So now let's get into testing types, because a lot of times I used to have clients who would ask me, well, can I test it myself? And I would say, absolutely, you can, you totally can. But there's several problems with that, which I'll get into later. But I want to talk about all of the types that are available for an owner to choose from. So the first one, you guys have probably seen this, is the instant lead testing. They're the lead swabs. They're plastic, and you crack them. They do that nice little crunchy sound. You swab it on the paint, and if it's red, it's lead. So that's the just traditional lead-based paint test. The second one is the D-lead detection system. This one's a little bit more advanced. You got to mix some chemicals. You got to like peel off a little bit of paint and stick it in a jar and shake it up. And if it's a certain color, it will tell you how much lead is there. It's a little bit more in depth, and will tell you the parts per million of lead concentrate. Whereas the lead swabs are just kind of like, yes, I see it. No, I don't, kind of thing. So this gets kind of confusing, because if you're doing one of these two types of lead tests and you want the whole property done, that could take you forever to determine where there's lead and where there's not. The other type of testing that you can do is sending it to an accredited lab, an NLAAP lab. And you would basically, let's say you're working on the exterior, you want to know if it has lead or not. You would take off samples from each area that you would be working from. So, maybe all 4 sides of the house, and you would label them front exterior, right exterior, left exterior. Then you label it all up, send it to a lab. Lab would get it back and tell you specifically how much lead is present, and so on and so forth. So that is another great option, but the option itself does take a little bit longer, and I don't really have time to sit around and wait for a laboratory to get back to me on whether or not lead is present. So a lot of people don't really choose that option. So let's talk about why you wouldn't maybe do some self-testing. The number one reason that you would not do self-testing is because the stick, if it's red, it's lead, is just far too sensitive. So it's literally going to pick up every single molecule of lead there, and it's just going to tell you if it's present or not. So EPA has standards as far as what they consider too much lead, and what is that threshold for us needing to use lead safe work practices. So you can kind of see that the rule is 1 milligram per centimeter squared, whereas the stick is so sensitive that it's 0.3 milligram per centimeter squared. So you can kind of see the difference. So you might be using lead safe work practices on a lead swab when it's not necessary. So that could be extremely costly if you chose to go that route. If you do not test, if you choose not to test the property, and again, you're using the target property for compensation, it must be assumed that lead is present everywhere. Okay, so that's the big caveat that I tell people. It's like, if you're using the property for compensation, it's a target property, and you have not had it tested, you have to assume that lead is everywhere. And so how do you protect yourself, your liability? You have the property tested. So if you're ever in a situation where HUD and EPA is auditing you, maybe you're a property manager or you have several investment properties of your own, HUD will not allow you to self-test your properties. They'll actually require you, if you get involved in an audit, they'll require you to do professional testing with certified reports, and then they will ask you and require you to do remediation services on top of your fine, which again can be quite costly. And then again, for HUD and EPA lead-based paint disclosure rule, the 1 milligram per square centimeter is considered the standard that must be used to determine if lead-safe practices are applicable. So to know for sure, it's best to have it tested professionally. So this little futuristic gun type thing that you see here is actually testing the exterior of a property here in Salem. You can kind of see in this photo the cracking that we talked about, the peeling of the paint. It's since been painted over, but that gun specifically is called an XRF, and it's very expensive, but it has 3 main components. It's got a radiation source, a detector, and a processor. And so how it works is the energy of the radiation is absorbed by the atoms of the alloy you're working with. So in this case, it's lead. Then billions of a second later, that energy is absorbed and released, and then the released radiation gets shot in many directions, and some of it will hit the detector, at which point it will indicate all the levels of lead that are in every single layer of paint. So it's extremely detailed, and it will tell you specifically how much lead you're working with. So this type of testing is the only way to have all the layers of the paint fully analyzed without disturbing the surface area. So if you're working with a seller or a buyer for that matter that wants to have the property tested as part of a real estate transaction, perhaps the seller's not willing to let you scrape every single surface of the exterior of the home to allow it to have it tested, this is the only way that you can do that without disturbing the surface area of the property. So here's an example of what a report comes back and tells you. So you can kind of see I want to talk specifically about the interior components under section 3.4, where it talks about the reading. So it bounces around. It's got reading 360, 363, 364, kind of keeps tabs on how many readings it's taking. And it says, okay, this is positive, right? So all of these areas are positive for lead-based paint because they're over and above that one centimeter per square inch rule, right? So the reading, for example, on 360 for the wall was in the kitchen, and it was positive at 1.80. And then moving on, you can kind of see again another reading. So it will tell you the number of positive readings was 21 with a total number of readings of 82. So the percent that was actually positive for this property was 25.61. So you're only talking about 25% of the property that needs lead safe work practices. So that's really not that much. And really, as long as you're not disturbing lead-based paint and you disclose it, it's fine. You don't have to do anything with it, but it's when you go and you need to repair that kitchen or you plan to replace the kitchen cabinets and you know that there's lead there, you have to use lead safe work practices. But in this case, this property was built in 1920. It was in a really high-end area of Salem, and so it did have a good percentage of lead-based paint, and so that's why you see only 25% of the property was in fact positive. So this particular owner knows that when they do, remediation on any of these areas, they know what area they need to do lead safe work practices and which ones they don't. In this case, this owner was also an investor, and it was tenant occupied, and the tenant had, disclosures, was able to see this report, understood that there was lead present in the home and where it was located. And so it was much easier for them to do lead safe work practices. And it's much more cost effective for the investor because they don't have to use a lead certified contractor if they're not working on those specific items. So hopefully that makes sense to you guys. I know I'm kind of talking about a lot here, but if you have any questions, again, just jump in. So this is a slide that I was talking to you about. And so, oh, look, 1960 to 1978, 24%. I think I said that. Yeah. I think I might officially be a nerd, you guys. I don't know. But yeah, right, a lead-based paint nerd. So, I mean, really, we're talking about the percentage of homes that are likely to contain lead. So if you're working with an investor who's 1960 to 1978, they found the perfect property. Let's say it's built in 1965. They plan on using it for compensation. You can see that it might fall in that 24%, or it might not. I mean, we're talking about a very small margin of properties. And so that one-time outlet of having it professionally tested might be beneficial for them because they don't have to use lead-safe practices once they confirm there is no lead. Between 1940 and 1960, obviously that percentage jumps a little bit, goes to 69%, and then it jumps again if it's built before 1940, and that's 87%. So again, that's just the percentage that we find typically. And a lot of times I've seen so many testing results for properties, and in this 1960 to 1978 area, I remember there was one property in South Salem that was built in 1970, and it had one wall in one bedroom that had lead-based paint on it. And again, it's just a good example of somebody had paint in their garage that had lead in it, and it was just randomly painted on a wall, but otherwise the whole house was lead-free. So, and that was, again, an investment property, and so that owner didn't have to use lead-safe practices unless they were specifically touching that wall in that bedroom. So let's say work practices. Let's not be an ostrich. Let's not bury our head in the sand. Let's kind of address it and teach our clients what that looks like. So you can become a certified professional, or you can hire one. So a lot of times what I'll tell my investor clients is, hey, you know what, if you're going to buy a target property, have it tested. And if you want to be able to work on your property and use lead-safe practices, you absolutely can. You just have to be certified, because then it eliminates the liability for you. So it's super easy for clients who are investors, slippers, or property managers, and they wish to work on their target properties. They need to test to know for certain what areas are, in fact, lead-based paint. Lead-based paint, what's the word I'm looking for?
Affected.
Yeah, thank you. Affected, perfect. They need to hire a certified contractor, or they can become a lead certified contractor themselves. It's for typical people, it's just you and I, Kayla, if we wanted to go down, it's an 8-hour class. It's $200. It's you pay $50 per year to the CCB to keep it active, which is seriously, that's super cheap when you're talking about investment properties. You know, that's again another business write-off. And then private citizens, $250 for a 5-year license to the health department. So it's minimal. And there's really no point. If you have somebody who wants to work on them, they should just go get it. It's not a big deal. It's like very simple to keep it updated and effective. So before any work begins, how many of you guys, okay, this is not a live class, so I can't see how many arms are up, but I would hope that you have seen this pamphlet. It's called the Renovate Right pamphlet. If not, you definitely need to look this up. You can find it on the EPA website. The Renovate Right pamphlet has to be served if you are working on a property that's occupied by tenants. It's a target property, so it's pre-78, and you don't know if there's lead, or if you do know that there's lead and the area that you're working on is affected. Okay, so this pamphlet is super important to be able to deliver to. And 9 times out of 10, if you ask contractors, the ones that you hire, if they know about this Renovate Right packet, it's few and far between that they've ever seen it. So it would be a good idea for you to have conversations with those certified contractors to make sure that they are delivering it and that they understand. Looks like there's a question.
Yeah, one person said that they have not seen it. So where can they see it?
Oh, if you go to if you just go to Google and you type in Renovate Right pamphlet EPA, it'll automatically link up the PDF, and you just click on it.
Cool.
Yeah, super easy. So make sure you guys read through it, because there's a lot of really good information in it, and I promise it's not like watching paint dry. So it's not like reading the lead-based paint rule, but it does have really good information. So this pamphlet would be provided to the tenant. Okay, let's for this circumstance entirely, let's just say that it's occupied, you're planning to remodel a bathroom, and the friction surface, the lead affected area is on the kitchen or the bathroom cabinets. Okay, so you would serve the tenant with this Renovate Right pamphlet, and you would have a copy of the sample pre-renovation form. So you can see off to the right here that there's an occupant confirmation. They have the right to check that they've received it. If they're not home, or if they refuse it, it's important that you either mark declined or unavailable for signature, and that you, as the person delivering it, you have a record of it, and the attempted delivery date, and then the signature, and then the unit address. Okay, so this is another one where the fine $16,000 per infraction. This is the big one. This is the one where people like don't even know that this exists. So it's just super important that you guys familiarize yourselves with this. You provide it to your clients if they're investors, or if they're flipping, or if they're trying to sell a target property with tenants in it and they need to do some work. Just super important that you make sure you familiarize yourself with this form. So there's also really good questions in there that are frequently asked from occupants who are receiving renovation on a lead property. So it's like, what should we do with our furniture, which I'll kind of go over in just a minute. And what is lead dust, and what can it do if we are poisoned, and so on and so forth. So, and obviously our goal is not to hype up our tenants and make them concerned, but it is to make them aware to eliminate your liability, but also to make sure that the contractor that you've hired is doing their job and is well aware of the lead safe practices that need to be done.
So Ashley, if you're a property manager and you're managing a home that was built prior to 1978 and they wanted to do a renovation, say you tested the home and found out that there was lead, whose responsibility is it to make sure that this Renovate Right form gets signed? Would that be the property manager's responsibility?
I would say that it is the property manager's responsibility, but it could certainly pass to the property owner for not making sure that the property management company was doing their own job.
Got it.
So, I mean, twofold, HUD likes to go after people who have deep pockets, and typically that's the brokerages, that's the property managers, but that can be the owner as well. I mean, you could have somebody who has 30 properties and half of those are target properties, and that could open up a whole investigation and an issue and so on and so forth. So it's just really important that you are just making sure you're familiarized with the rule. And I mean, again, we can't force people to follow the law, but we can absolutely advise them and make sure that they are equipped with as much information as possible. And I think, again, I just don't think people realize how much liability can be involved with lead-based paint. They just think, oh, it's just the real estate disclosure in a transaction. And then next thing you know, you're in an issue, and it just goes so much deeper than that. So it's a good question.
Yeah.
So some lead safe practices include absolutely no power washing or power sanding. That's like a big no-no. Don't do it. Scrape and brush off the exterior after laying plastic down to catch all of the paint chips. You need to use special heavy primer to lock down all the lead surfaces prior to painting. So that's a really good example for exterior paint. So if you've got that alligator texture on a property and you know that it's lead, you can scrape off the chips very delicately, catch them in plastic, and then paint over with a really heavy primer. I think there's a Sherwin-Williams primer that you can use that's very like thick. It's almost like glue, dries over the top, and then you can paint on top of that. And then always follow up with a finish coat, and then bag up all your paint chips using the special tying method, then throw them away. So I'll show you examples of what that tying method looks like here in a minute. But so those are some of the lead safe practices. Preparing for renovation when it's occupied, all work areas should not be accessible to occupants while the work occurs. You know, they may need to use alternate bedrooms or kitchen arrangements if those are the areas that they're going to be working in. You do need a safe place for your pets because, you know, pets are important too, and they can get lead poisoning. Separate pathway for the contractor from the work area to the outside. A place to store your furniture because, again, furniture can absorb that lead dust. So every time you sit on it, just imagine a big puff of lead smoke, basically. Turn off forced air heating and air conditioning so that that is not being circulated through the property. And then you may want to move out of your home temporarily, depending on what work is being done. So during and after any lead work, they absolutely need to contain the area. So make sure that there's no dust or debris that can escape. So a lot of times in those properties, you'll see big plastic worksheets that are keeping plastic or dust in that contained area. Avoid renovation methods that generate large amounts of lead contaminated dust. So again, there's that power washing or that sanding. Open flame would be a bad idea. Torching, grinding, blasting, that's all considered just bad idea. Generally just stay away from that anyway. Clean up thoroughly. So the work area should be cleaned up daily to keep it as clean as possible always. When the work is completed, the area must be cleaned up using special methods before taking the plastic down. So contractors need to be using a HEPA vacuum to make sure that they're obtaining all the dust and debris. And then they need to do a lot of wet wiping and wet mopping with plenty of rinse water to make sure that that lead is cleaned up completely. So now I want to show you guys a really good example of some properties and testing and kind of remediation work and what that looked like. So this is a single family property here in Salem. It was built in 1938. And you might be interested to know that it did have lead-based paint on the exterior, but it was a lead-free interior. So this particular property was an investment property. It's tenant occupied. In fact, this property was actually Section 8 tenant occupied. So you might remember that the square footage changed from 6 square feet of the interior to 3 square feet of the interior. So this property owner got very lucky because that square footage going from 6 to 3 is very, very small. So anytime, so let's say he's even replacing the outlet covers. I mean, that could add up to more than 6 square feet pretty quickly. So the owner no longer has to do any lead safe work practice on the interior because he knows that it's lead free. Now, anytime he does something on the exterior, he knows that he needs to be treating it with lead safe practices if it's over 16 square feet. Okay, so this property had a little bit of peeling paint under the eaves of the property. You can kind of see there right next to the gutter. It's a really good example again of typical possible lead-based paint. So on the right side, he had used that primer from Sherwin-Williams, the one that just kind of acts a little bit like glue. When you pour it out, it kind of reminds me of that Elmer's like sticky white glue. You know what I'm talking about? Yeah. That's what it looks like. And the idea behind that is really to keep the paint chips up into the property so that when you paint over the top of it, it looks like a smoother surface and it's not, you don't have that weatherization that can happen with lead-based paint. So this is an example of the time method. This is seriously what you go to the 8-hour class for. This is the time method. I know it's so silly. But you you tie the bag and you kind of fold it in on itself, and then you use fold it again, and then you use this painter's tape, and then you wrap it around it, and then you literally just throw it away. So I don't know. I don't know who came up with that. But
what if it busts open?
I don't know. They don't even require you to double bag it or anything. So it's just like, hey, we got this paint chip and we're just gonna throw it in the landfill because it's all good. Anyway, so that's a great example, but this is the stuff that you learn out of that 8-hour class. So yeah, anyway, moving on. So that's a good example of one property that was lead-based paint and how it was remediated. The next one, this is another property in Salem. It was built in 1928 and it had lead paint exterior, again, because lead was expensive. Most people are going to put it on the outside of a property. It had lead paint on one door. Random. I don't know I can't remember if that was like the exterior door or the front door. Lead paint on an enclosed back stairway, and then a friction hazard on the front porch. So for this target property, HUD wanted the owner to eliminate the friction hazard at the front porch. And so the owner was going to paint the property anyway. So of course they did lead safe work practices. They used the primer, they repainted it. It's totally fine. But for the friction hazard, they had to go through and do a couple of things to remediate it. And so there they are painting it. And you can kind of see on the front porch there on the right that the friction surface was the back deck had been painted with lead-based paint. And so what was happening is people would be walking or jumping on it, and then the screen door and the front door would open and it would hit and scratch the surface. And so rather than removing the floor of the porch, they literally just took quarter plywood, put it over the porch, and then painted over it, which eliminated the friction surface. So works. Yeah. But that's an example of what HUD is going to ask you to do if your client gets into an audit situation. So you can see how it can be very, very costly if you're not taking care of disclosing properly and making sure that the property is, whether it's lead or not. This is another single family property here in Salem. This property was built in 1920, and this is actually the same property that you saw using the XRF gun in the previous slide. It's got a lead paint exterior, lead paint on 1 kitchen and 3 bathroom walls, which is, again, so random. It's just a case of somebody using garage paint. Yeah. And then friction hazard on a basement stair tread. So again, this was another target property that had wanted remediated during that review. And so they asked the owner of the property to go through and correct the friction hazard and remove all of the friction surfaces. So in this slide, you can see kind of the previous slide on the left where the friction hazards were. So the handrail and the staircase was painted with lead paint. And so the contractor basically used plastic, encapsulated that entire area to make sure it was clean, removed the handrails and the friction treads of the surfaces and just repainted them. So it was no longer a friction hazard. But there it is, it's completed, it's been repainted, and it's all brand new wood, and the lead has been removed from that particular property. Kayla, how are we doing on time?
We're doing good. You have about 9 minutes.
Oh, perfect. Okay, so there's a couple points I want to bring up with you guys. Just moving forward, going back to your real estate practice, you know, what is your standard of care and practice going to be? So the first question I have for you is, when you're buying or selling a target property with tenant occupants, are you requesting a copy of the rental agreement and a copy of the lead-based paint disclosure to ensure it was executed at the time of tenant's move-in? That's a really good question, because 9 times out of 10, I can't tell you how many investment properties I've worked with where I've seen a rental agreement, it's a target property, and there's no lead-based paint addendum. That makes that just makes steam come out of my ears, because that's generating liability for my purchaser, right? So just be thinking about that, be asking those questions. I mean, a lot of times if you're listing an investment property, you're asking for the rent roll. Is the tenant paying their rent on time? If your client is inheriting the tenant, were they properly served? Because you're passing liability from one party to another. And although those audits might be few and far between, our job is to eliminate as much risk for our clients as possible. So just be asking those questions, be asking to see copies of those rental agreements for your client, make sure that those have been executed at the time of their move-in. And then, are you sure that each of the target property has a properly filled out lead-based paint disclosure form? So whenever you're representing either a purchase or a sale, you make sure that those are properly filled out. And please, please, please make sure that you're not signing on that line, which I forget off the top of my head, if there's no documents on that disclosure form, because that is like the one thing that I seriously beat my head against the wall with my brokers. I'm like, guys, it's not applicable. So again, just be careful of that, because it's a $16,000 fine. And then, what kind of liability are you creating for your client if you did not verify those things? So again, it's just thinking down the rabbit hole, trying to be 5 steps ahead of that lead-based paint liability, and just making sure that your clients are protected. And then, more points to ponder when selling or representing a buyer who is purchasing an investment and the subject is a target property, again, prior to 78. Are you making sure the contractor doing the work has taken the lead-based paint class and is actively licensed? If so, are you documenting your file? That's another great question. I mean, we so often have contractors that are hired by people and recommended by people, and if it's a target property and compensation is involved, you know, best to make sure that they're licensed and that they have lead-based paint practices under their belt. And then, will you become educated on the subject so you're able to completely inform your client as to the benefits of testing and their responsibilities? Can we be held liable if we do not do so? I don't really know, but I you know, until there's really case law against brokers for this, it's just one of those things where it's better to be prepared, right? It's better to just know what you're working with and advise people, and what they choose to do with that is up to them. But we can absolutely document our file. Of broker notes are, you know, it's all fine till it's not fine, and anybody can sue anybody for any reason. So it's just good for us to be making sure that we are educating and documenting, and what they choose to do with that information is up to them. So I think that's pretty much it. The last couple slides I have for you are some terms, because I know I covered quite a bit. So make sure you read through those, because that's really, really good. But do we have any questions?
Doesn't look like anything's come up.
You guys are so quiet.
It's the beauty of a webinar.
Do you have any questions, Kayla?
No, I
No.
think you've covered it all. You hit it out of the park. Man, I didn't know I would learn so much about lead-based paint today.
I know. There's just like so much to talk about with lead. It's just funny
Yeah.
how that works. But yeah, if you guys ever have any questions, if you need some referral sources for contractors who do lead-based paint, please feel free to reach out. I'm happy to give you some contacts that I've used in the past. And then again, if you guys need any copies of like the Renovate Right or anything, a lot of this information is going to be available on EPA's website. So do make sure that you guys go there, you review the Renovate Right pamphlet, you familiarize yourself with it, and then read the Renovate rule.
Someone did send a question in. Do you use an addendum on top of the lead-based paint addendum that discloses that you've informed your clients?
I do not. Nope, I just do broker notes. I think sometimes we have a tendency to over-addendum. Over-addendum our people. I mean, RE/MAX Integrity has a client information letter that kind of talks about those additional inspections, but I would refer back to your principal broker and see how they would like you to handle that. But for my brokers, I would very much say that having the conversation, documenting that conversation in an email saying, hey, Mr. Jones, I just want to follow up with our conversation regarding lead-based paint. Here's the Renovate Right rule, link it in your email, make sure you have it, and then upload that email to your file. I think that's probably sufficient, but every principal broker runs things a little bit differently. And so I would definitely seek out your PB and ask them how they'd like you to handle that. But I know for me in my office, that I think is satisfactory.
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Ashley, so much for coming in today.
Yes, thank you for having me.
So much, and this has been great. So just a reminder to everyone watching, for your sign-in sheets, go ahead and send them in. If you can get them in to me before Monday or Tuesday, that'd be wonderful, via email to info@oregonrealtors.org. If you have any questions that come up for you after this that you might want to get Ashley's take on, just send me an email and I'll see if she'd be willing to
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah, absolutely. If you guys have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. I'm always available. I like to be a resource. Again, I'm kind of a lead-based paint nerd. My husband makes so much fun of me because I could talk about it for hours. And what's funny is I was really nervous about this because I didn't know I was going to be able to talk for an hour. And then here I am talking for an hour about lead-based paint. So
you're 3 minutes dry, so that's good.
Oh, good.
Got out a little early.
Good. Well, I hope everybody has a great day. And again, thank you all so much for letting me be here. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Ashley.